What is today Latin America was once many native nations. Spain, Portugal, France, England, the Dutch, and Danish invaded. They carried out genocide after genocide and enslaved both natives and Africans. After independence, most new governments were still white-dominated, with more genocides against natives in nations like Argentina, Brazil, and Chile. European powers hold on to some territories even today and kept invading to take their colonies back. The United States invaded too, overthrowing or trying to overthrow over 60 governments, the last attempt in the year 2020 in Venezuela. The U.S. also took half of Mexico's land and a tenth of its people, and then Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands. There is a long history of many Americans fearing and hating Latinos. Latin America's image and reality is often one of instability, poverty, drug cartels, revolutions, corruption, and refugees. But it did not have to be this way. Latin America could remain all or mostly native nations. I spoke about this in detail in the previous series, What If Natives Won? Poverty, white domination, and foreign invasions could have been stopped, prevented, or limited. The U.S. could have been more Latino culturally, with higher numbers of Latinos. The U.S. could have been less racist, less dominating, or the U.S. could be defeated. Some Latin American nations could even become regional or world powers. There is a huge lack of alternate history about Latin America and Latinos. So much alternate history is Europe-centered, mostly because so much history and history teaching is Europe-centered. This series is dedicated to scenarios, points of departure, and possibilities of Latin American victory within Latin America, and a more Latino or less racist American society. My name is Al Carroll. I'm Associate Professor of History at Northern Virginia Community College. I've written mostly about wars, veterans, human rights, and genocide. My next history book will be Genocide Denial in America, about the 7 genocides against indigenous people that took place in the U.S. that most people were never taught about, don't know, or deny. I've also written some science fiction, mostly alternate history. One story, Timely Saviors, appeared in a short story collection, The Witness Paradox. I'm also, together with Rob Schmidt of Bluecorn Comics, editing and putting out a short story alternate history collection, What If Natives Won? I've also written a sci-fi alternate history book, The Man in Black, the first of a series. Brazil is different from the rest of Latin America, and not just because of language. It never broke into many nations. It is one huge nation of over 200 million, almost twice as big as the next largest, Mexico. It is over 4 times larger than any other in Latin America, and larger than the continental U.S. It has the greatest mineral wealth and the largest protected region, the Amazon forest. It is also the largest black majority nation in the entire world, just ahead of Nigeria. But it pretends not to be. It is the most unequal nation anywhere in Latin America by both race and class. Its whites live like whites in Western Europe, while its blacks and mixed people live like the poorest in Africa. And its white Brazilians often pretend Brazil has no racism, or not much. Brazil also has the worst police violence in the entire world. Over 5,000 killings by them each year, almost 5 times that of the U.S., over 30 times worse than Canada, and over 500 times worse than Britain. Just one city, Rio de Janeiro, has more killings than the entire United States by police. And 80% of the victims of Brazil's cops are black, while almost all of its cops are white. Brazil also kept slavery the longest of any nation in the Americas, and committed 2 outright genocides against Amazon Indians, the last only ending in 1990. Brazil elected an outright fascist and open racist, Bolsonaro. But much of this could change. Both Spain and Portugal faced independence movements in their Latin American colonies. In 1807, Napoleon invaded Portugal. A year later, he invaded Spain. Latin America's colonies had been fighting for independence in some places for over 50 years. But with Spain and Portugal occupied fighting France for their home countries, independence became much easier. In Spain, the wars for independence lasted over 30 years. All those colonies eventually became Latin American independent nations. Some leaders like Bolivar tried to keep the region together as one big nation, but different provinces broke away and split into over a dozen nations. Sometimes they further broke away, as in Central America. This didn't happen in Brazil. In Spain, the king was captured by Napoleon. In Portugal, the emperor and his entire court and government escaped by ship only a few hours before Napoleon's armies. They sailed to Rio, and the empire proclaimed Brazil and Portugal to be equal nations in 1822. Dom Pedro II proclaimed the Empire of Brazil, ruling for over 50 years until forced out by the military. Brazil stayed one nation while Spain's colonies became almost 24. Some people insist the Empire of Brazil was stable, but there were many revolts trying to break away at the same time as in Spanish colonies. This map shows where the revolts were and their intended nations. Many of the revolts were from the 1820s to 1840s, similar to Spain's colonies. What if the Prince Regent of Portugal is captured by Napoleon? Brazil has no later monarch to declare independence. It has no emperor to unite its elites of different regions. Traditionally, the saying is Brazil's elites were café com leite, coffee with milk, the coffee-growing elites of Sao Paulo on the left against the dairy cattle elite of Minas Gerais on the right. Without a monarch, these conflicts come sooner. So after fighting off Portuguese troops, Brazil would split into 7 more nations. Sao Paulo's coffee plantation owners dominate what's left of Brazil. The cattle ranchers dominate most of the northeast nations. Start with the first of these, an Amazon state, Grão-Pará. In our own timeline, this was the Kabanagam Revolt. Kabanagam were the traditional homes of the poor. Grão-Pará was about 120,000 people at the time. About a fourth were natives, another fourth black slaves. And mixed race, mostly very poor people, were almost all the rest. Whites only numbered 15,000. In our own timeline, the revolt began in 1835, with uprisings led by plantation slaves and an army mutiny. After losing 2 leaders, its longest president or commander was Eduardo Angelim. In crushing the rebellion, the national government may have killed up to a third of the people of Grão-Pará. The Mali and Ragamuffin revolts were at the same time, and there was another revolt only a couple of years before, plus a war with Argentina and Britain. Without a unifying emperor, Brazil could face all separate wars, all 4 of them at once, and most or all succeed. Grão-Pará was the farthest from the population centers of Brazil, the least important economically, and the likeliest the national government wouldn't devote that much effort. The states that today make up what used to be Grão-Pará have more than 15 million people. The remnants of Brazil likely still fights a deadly war with Paraguay in a few years, and likely still has integralist and fascist movements in the 20th century, and military dictatorships. Perhaps even stronger since it has fewer non-whites. The good news is Brazil's military dictators have no control over the Amazon unless they decide to invade. There were 2 separate genocides in modern Brazil. The first was during the rubber boom, with mass enslavement and massacres. The second, the military carried out an incredibly brutal, outright genocide against Amazon Indians from 1950 to 1990. They, plus miners and cattlemen militias, exterminated 80 tribes with massacres and mass poisonings, killing 800,000. This is a genocide praised by the current would-be dictator with fascist beliefs in Brazil, Bolsonaro. But Grão-Pará has all the Amazon basin except part of the coast. Living in a nation with almost all natives, blacks, and mixed-race people, both these genocides are prevented. The big exception is in the northern part of the remains of Brazil, the area that today includes the capital, Brasilia. Because some of the Amazon tribes are in both nations, it's almost certain Grão-Pará tries to stop this genocide, even possible they lead an alliance of the separatist nations that overthrow the dictatorship and crush fascism in Brazil. The Mali Revolt in 1835 was in Bahia province in northeast Brazil. Muslim slaves attacked a prison during Ramadan. They were defeated because a slave informer warned the authorities in advance. Prison guards plus cavalry attacked the rebels, killing or capturing most. A military officer led the Kabanagam Revolt only 2 years later, and it included a vow to end slavery. It was defeated after 4 months, but these revolts were serious enough that it led to the end of the slave trade in Brazil. But if the revolt had worked, it starts off with freeing prisoners and the deaths of most of the prison guards, and a general uprising of the many Muslim slaves in Brazil. It is very likely to be independent since the revolt is close in time to the Grapara uprising. Bahia today is about 15 million people, 15 million, 80% of them black or mixed race. It also has one of the highest crime rates, with many killed by the police. That's far less likely as a Muslim state. It might still be poor, but it will be less unequal and racist, and thus much less police violence. The Ragamuffin Revolt at the same time lasted much longer, almost a decade. Two breakaway republics were declared. First the Rio Grandese, or Piratini, and then the Juliana Republic. They were aided by Uruguay, and there were plans to unite had the revolts succeeded. The two provinces today have 18 million people. Joined with Uruguay, the nation today would be over 21 million. Uruguay today is more equal politically, socially, and economically, and more stable than most of the rest of Latin America. The Balailada, or Basket Makers Revolt, was in the north, Maranhão province. An army of escaped slaves allied with cattle ranchers to overthrow the government. The government crushed it by repression and then offered amnesty. But if the other revolts already succeeded, the government is more likely to lose. Maranhão is today over 7 million people, 75% of them black or mixed, with small numbers of Asians and natives. A nation founded by a slave revolt will have far fewer racist police murders. It may stay poor, but it will be less unequal. The earliest revolt was the Confederation of Ecuador, no relation to the present country of Ecuador today. It was an anti-central state revolt, wanting a federal state for Brazil. Happening almost 20 years before the other revolts, it is still likely to fail. But once the other revolts succeed, a second uprising likely happens again, freeing the rest of the Northeast from Brazil. The area today is over 22 million people, 2/3 of them black or mixed race. The region has produced left-of-center politicians like Lula da Silva. The last major early revolt was in 1842 in Minas Gerais province that is slightly away from the central coast. This was another revolt against central control like the Confederation, led by wealthy elites. This revolt was easily defeated since the others had already been crushed. The Emperor Dom Pedro also carried out reforms to placate them. Without an emperor, this is less likely. Minas Gerais is today over 21 million people. Over half are black or mixed race, but in the south the province is almost all white, with many Italian and Portuguese immigrants. If all the revolts succeed, there are 7 other Portuguese-speaking states in Latin America. Islam would be the dominant religion in Bahia. 4 of these states would be majority black or part of the mixed race. Grapara would be majority native. These 5 non-white majority nations are far less racist, especially with far less of the racist police violence that makes Brazil one of the most dangerous nations in the world. 2 Amazon Indian genocides would have been prevented. Brazil's military dictatorship may have ended much sooner. In almost every way, Brazil and its peoples are much better off as 8 nations instead of 1. This is the end of the video. Please repost freely, like, quote, and comment. This has been Latin American Victory. Next time we will discuss what if Mexico stayed an empire.